There is a land where empires once rose and disappeared. But the greatest secrets are not hidden in its ruins, because while human history was carved into stone, another story continued unfolding in silence. An invisible story, relentless, and still happening. Here, where water can vanish for years, life follows different rules. Every movement matters, every mistake has a cost, and not all survive long enough to learn. But what's most intriguing is not this land's past. It's what continues to happen here, every single day. The Holy Land is often remembered for its ancient cities, sacred sites, and thousands of years of history. But there is another story unfolding here, quieter and far older. Long before civilizations, this land was already shaped by unforgiving natural forces. The climate has never been predictable. Rainfall is rare or irregular, and in many places, it simply disappears for long periods of time. And yet, life doesn't just survive, it specializes. In the Negev desert and the Judean mountains, every detail matters. A single misstep can be enough. And still, this harsh environment supports some of the most refined survival strategies in nature. Mammals that live with almost no water, predators that depend entirely on silence, birds that cross entire continents, just to find a chance to continue here. Everything revolves around something invisible, yet decisive. Water. It shapes movement, behavior, and connects species that seem unrelated at first glance. And it's not just animals that follow this rhythm. For thousands of years, humans have learned to read this land, to live, move, and grow according to its unpredictability. But today, that balance is beginning to shift. Climate, expansion, and resource use are changing a system that once depended on precision. And understanding this land, not just as history, but as a living ecosystem, reveals far more than expected. Because here, nothing happens by chance. And if this kind of story captures your attention, there's much more waiting to be discovered. The day begins before the sun appears. The cold from the night still lingers in the rocks, but not for long. Within minutes, everything changes. Light reaches the slopes, and with it, the heat arrives, fast, direct, without transition. And it's within this narrow window that most movement happens. High along the rocky formations, a shape emerges. An ibex. It doesn't hesitate. It moves across a near vertical wall, placing its weight on points that barely seem to exist. How every step is calculated, not by choice, but by necessity. Up there is food. Sparse, scattered, but enough to continue. What it doesn't see is that it isn't alone. Somewhere below, blended into the shadows of the rock, something follows every movement, silent, patient. The Arabian leopard. It doesn't chase, it waits for the mistake. But mistakes here are rare, and time is working against both of them. The heat rises, the window of activity begins to close. Below, a different strategy unfolds. A small group of rock hyrax spreads across the stones. While some feed quickly, one remains completely still, watching. The body appears relaxed, but the eyes never stop moving. Any shift out of place is enough. And when it happens, the reaction is immediate. The group disappears. No hesitation, no confusion, as if they were never there. So now the sun dominates the sky. The shadows have almost vanished, and with them, the movement. What once felt active returns to stillness. But this is not absence, it's adaptation. Here, everything happens in short windows, precise moments, rapid decisions. Because in this place, survival doesn't belong to the strongest or the fastest, but to the one who understands exactly when to act. For long stretches of time, it seems like nothing happens. The ground remains dry, riverbeds lie empty, and the landscape holds the same appearance, day after day. But that doesn't mean life is absent. It means it's waiting. Here, water is not part of a routine. It's an event. And when it arrives, everything responds. The first signs don't always come from above. Sometimes they begin far from here, as rain falling in distant regions moves silently across the land until it finds a path. And then, suddenly, the desert reacts. Wadas, dry channels that for months looked like nothing more than marks in the earth, come back to life. Water appears, fast, without warning, rushing through pathways that have always existed, simply waiting for the right moment. And that shift triggers an almost immediate chain reaction. The ground, once hardened, begins to soften. Seeds that remained dormant for years awaken. Within days, patches of vegetation begin to emerge, and with them, movement. Insects appear in large numbers, drawn to this brief window of abundance. For many, this is all the time they have. Entire life cycles unfold in a matter of days. Within hours after the rain, the landscape is no longer the same, or small reptiles leave their shelters. They move quickly, taking advantage of the moisture before it disappears again. And close behind them come the predators. The desert fox becomes active, light, silent, constantly alert. It doesn't rely on a single type of prey. It takes advantage of the moment. Insects, small vertebrates, whatever opportunity presents itself. Because in this environment, too much specialization can be a risk, and abundance never lasts. Among all who live here, few represent this logic better than the golden jackal. It doesn't wait for ideal conditions. It adapts to whatever is available. It can hunt, it can scavenge, it can travel long distances in search of something that works. That flexibility allows it to remain active even as the environment shifts rapidly. But perhaps the most remarkable impact of this transformation doesn't happen on the ground. It happens above, in the sky. The Holy Land lies along one of the most important migratory routes on the planet. Every year, millions of birds cross this region, and not by coincidence. They follow paths that depend directly on places where water appears, even if only for a short time. The Jordan Valley becomes one of those places, a corridor of life in the middle of aridity. There, birds find food, rest, and recover energy to continue journeys that span entire continents. Some travel thousands of kilometers, and without these stops, they wouldn't make it. Among them, large birds of prey take advantage of thermal currents rising from the terrain, gliding with minimal effort. But in the end, even that efficiency depends on what happens below. Without food, without water, without that brief interval, there is no journey. Everything is connected. Rain falling far away shapes what happens here. Plants support insects. Insects support smaller animals. And all of them, directly or indirectly, sustain larger predators. It's an invisible network. Precise, but fragile. Because everything depends on something that cannot be controlled. The arrival, or absence, of water. And when it takes longer than expected, the entire system begins to shift. The heat doesn't arrive all at once. It builds, first in the rocks, then in the air. And by the time it's noticed, everything has already changed. What once felt like constant movement begins to disappear. Not because life is gone, but because it needs to hide. Beneath the surface, the environment is completely different. Small tunnels become shelters against extreme temperatures. Down there, the air is more stable, enough to keep the body functioning. But staying hidden comes at a cost. Less time to feed, fewer opportunities, and total dependence on choosing the exact right moment to emerge. On the surface, only a few take the risk. A lizard appears. It remains still for a few seconds, absorbing just enough heat to activate its body. Then it moves, runs, stops, moves again. Short, controlled bursts. Not urgency. Control. Stay still too long, and it overheats. Move too much, and the same happens. Every second must be calculated. At the same time, something almost invisible is taking place. Insects begin to emerge, but not in search of food. They are searching for moisture. During the early hours, a thin layer of condensation forms on cooler surfaces. It's minimal, almost imperceptible, but enough. Some species have developed precise behaviors to collect this moisture before it evaporates. Water, gathered from the air. No rivers, no rain, just timing. Higher up on the slopes, the situation looks different, but the challenge is the same. Ibex remain active longer than most animals, but even they have limits. Searching for food requires movement, and movement under this heat means losing both energy and water. Young ones observe. They learn routes, test their balance, but above all, they learn something more important: when to stop. Because here, pushing too far can be more dangerous than giving up. As the day progresses, even predators begin to withdraw. The leopard doesn't disappear. It waits. Actively hunting under this heat is not efficient. So the strategy shifts. Less movement, more observation, more patience, and that shift affects the entire system. Fewer active predators, fewer exposed prey, fewer encounters. The desert enters a nearly suspended state, but this balance is fragile because it depends on something that isn't present: water. And the longer it takes to return, the harder it becomes to sustain this rhythm. As the drought continues, balance begins to break down. Resources decline, and with them, the distance between species disappears. Encounters become unavoidable. The golden jackal is among the first to feel this shift. Naturally versatile, it has always relied on multiple food sources. But now, those options are fading, and that forces it to take greater risks. It approaches carcasses more boldly, moves through areas where other predators are present, crosses boundaries it once avoided. It's because at this point, retreating may mean not surviving. But every decision comes at a cost. Conflicts increase, encounters turn more aggressive, and even a minor injury can become decisive. Because here, recovery is never guaranteed. On the slopes, pressure builds in a different way. Ibex can no longer rely on higher ground alone. Vegetation is disappearing, and staying above is no longer enough. Descending means exposure, but staying means starvation. And that shift is exactly what the Arabian leopard waits for. Patient, it observes. It doesn't need to chase. It knows the environment will eventually bring opportunity closer. But success is never certain. The terrain remains unforgiving. The prey remains alert. And precision is still everything. Meanwhile, among the rocks, another form of tension emerges. The Hyrax groups begin to feel the strain. Less food means more competition within the group, and even cooperation starts to change. Who feeds first? Who takes the risk? Who waits? Small decisions with real consequences. And this pattern spreads across the ecosystem. Individual changes begin to accumulate until the system itself starts to transform. Predators become more active, prey more cautious. Routes begin to shift. Timings begin to change. Everything adjusts. Everything responds to a single reality: scarcity. But there is something more, something that adds another layer of complexity. This land is not occupied by wildlife alone. Humans are here too. And unlike other species, they don't just adapt, they transform the environment. Water is redirected, land is cultivated, spaces are reshaped, and with that, the rules change. Now, the system no longer depends only on climate. It also depends on decisions. And when those forces intersect, the outcomes become unpredictable. And this is just one of many places where nature is constantly rewriting its own rules. When the sun disappears, the desert doesn't rest. It reorganizes. The heat built up throughout the day begins to fade quickly. The air cools. The rocks release what they absorbed. And within hours, the entire environment transforms. But this change isn't uniform. Some areas cool faster. Others hold on to heat. And it's within these differences that movement begins. The first signs of activity don't come from large animals. They come from below. Beneath the sand, something shifts, almost invisible. A subtle movement reveals its presence, and then it's gone again. Above, silence, until it breaks. The desert fox appears, but it doesn't move immediately. It pauses, listens. Its ears adjust before the rest of its body follows. Something is there, but it can't be seen. For a few seconds, nothing happens, and then, suddenly, it strikes. A precise leap, direct. The sand collapses beneath it, and just as quickly, stillness returns, but it doesn't always succeed. And when it fails, it's not just a missed attempt, it's lost energy. It moves on, searches again. Another sound, another signal. Further away, the scene is different. There's no urgency, only presence. The Arabian leopard moves through the terrain. Slow, continuous, without hesitation. It doesn't react to the environment. It anticipates it. It avoids open ground. Uses shadow where there is almost none. Adjusts every step. But tonight, something is different. No movement ahead. No clear signal. No immediate opportunity. And still, it continues. Because here, stopping too soon can be just as dangerous as pushing too far. Below, the jackal follows a different logic. It doesn't follow silence. It follows traces. Scents left behind hours earlier. Barely visible remains. Small signs that something once happened here. Its path isn't straight. It shifts direction constantly. Tests, returns, moves forward again. This is less a search and more an interpretation. And that is what allows it to keep finding food when others cannot. Meanwhile, something else is happening, almost unnoticed. The temperature continues to drop, and with it, behavior shifts again. Insects begin to emerge, but not everywhere, only in specific pockets, where conditions allow. Some climb surfaces to collect moisture, and others simply appear, as if the desert has revealed a hidden layer. For a brief moment, there is abundance, but it's localized, unstable, and it fades quickly. Smaller predators take advantage, but they must act with precision, because this moment won't repeat itself the same way. As the night deepens, the cold intensifies, and once again, the environment shifts. Movement slows, encounters become rare. What was once dynamic begins to quiet, almost to stillness, but not entirely, because here, the desert is never truly still. It only shifts between phases, and understanding those phases defines who remains active and who disappears. Amid the dominant aridity, there is a stretch of land that breaks the pattern, the Jordan Valley. From above, it cuts through the landscape like a living line across an otherwise dry terrain. Here, water is not abundant, but it is present. And in this environment, that is enough to change everything. Vegetation begins to concentrate. The soil retains more moisture, and with that, life gathers. But the valley does not exist in isolation. It is part of something much larger, far beyond what can be seen at ground level. Above, in the sky, a constant movement unfolds. Millions of birds pass through this region every year, not by chance. They follow precise routes that depend on specific points where they can rest, feed, and continue. The Jordan Valley is one of those points, a natural corridor through a demanding landscape. Here, species from different continents converge. Some arrive from Africa, others from Europe or Asia. All of them depend on this place at some stage of their journey, not as a destination, but as a pause, a place to recover energy, to feed, and to continue. Without this pause, many of these journeys would not be possible. Among them, large birds of prey take advantage of rising thermal currents formed along the valley. They glide, effortless, covering vast distances with minimal energy. But even that efficiency depends on what happens below, because in the end, everything returns to the same point: availability, food, water, balance. But this balance does not belong to nature alone. For thousands of years, humans have also recognized the value of this valley, and they stayed. Water was redirected, land was cultivated, and gradually, parts of the valley were transformed. Today, agricultural fields occupy areas that were once entirely wild. Irrigation systems reshape how water moves, and the landscape responds. So some species adapt, finding new opportunities. Others face new challenges, because where there is food, there is presence. And where there is presence, there is interaction. Birds descend into cultivated fields. Animals approach in search of resources. And at times, what sustains life also creates conflict. Not constant, but inevitable. Still, the system continues to function, because certain elements remain. Water still flows, the cycle still exists, and life, in some way, continues to find space. But something is beginning to change, slowly, almost unnoticed. The balance no longer depends only on nature. Now it also depends on decisions, and that introduces a new variable, one that does not always follow the same rhythm. And when that rhythm shifts, everything connected to it must respond. Days pass, and nothing changes. The sky remains clear. No clouds, no signs of rain. Light falls the same way, again and again, and what once felt like a predictable cycle begins to stretch beyond its limits. At this point, the desert is no longer just demanding, it becomes unforgiving. Along the slopes, the first signs begin to appear. Ibex move farther. They travel longer distances, spend less time in each area. Food is no longer where it used to be, and finding it requires more effort. The young begin to struggle. Their movements slow. Pauses become more frequent. Keeping up with the group is no longer instinct. It becomes effort. And here, too much effort comes at a cost. Below, the silence becomes more noticeable. Insects decline. Reptiles appear less often. What once felt like quiet activity now feels empty. But it isn't. Life is still there, just reduced, yet contained, closer to its limit. The golden jackal senses this quickly. Its routes begin to expand. It travels farther, explores areas it would normally avoid, moves into unfamiliar territory, not by choice, by necessity. And when even the most adaptable begin to change their behavior, the entire system is under pressure. In the shadows of the rocks, the leopard remains. But now, waiting is no longer strategy. It's the only option. Prey is scarce, more alert, harder to find. Every attempt must be calculated with even greater precision, because the cost of failure has never been higher. Energy spent may not be recovered, and at this stage, that can define survival. The desert shifts into a different state, not just silence, absence, fewer movements, fewer encounters, fewer signs of life, as if everything is being filtered, reduced to what is strictly necessary. Only what can endure remains. But even endurance has a limit, and when that limit is reached, there is no warning, no transition, only change. Something in the air begins to shift, almost imperceptible, a subtle difference in temperature, a new weight in the wind, and in the distance, something begins to form. The change doesn't arrive with a warning. It begins almost unnoticed. First, in the air, a subtle shift in temperature, a different weight. Then the wind changes, and with it, something approaches. On the horizon, clouds begin to form. After so long, the sky is no longer empty. It moves, it builds, and then, without transition, rain, fast, intense, unrelenting. Water strikes the dry ground and, for a brief moment, disappears, absorbed instantly, as if the land is trying to hold on to every drop, but it can't. Within minutes, forgotten pathways reappear. Water begins to move, at first in thin streams, then with force. Wadis come back to life. What was once hardened earth becomes flow, motion, energy. The landscape reshapes itself in real time, but this transformation is not gentle. Currents surge forward, sediment shifts, the terrain is redrawn. And for many animals, this moment is as dangerous as the drought itself. Move too soon and risk being swept away. Wait too long and miss the opportunity, because what follows happens quickly. In the days that follow, the change becomes undeniable. The ground responds. Small shoots break through the surface. Vegetation spreads across areas that were once completely bare. And with it, life returns. Insects emerge in large numbers, taking advantage of every second, every surface, every opportunity. Reptiles return, moving quickly, activated by moisture, and behind them, predators follow. Ibex find food again. Their movements become shorter. Energy is conserved. The group regains its rhythm. The jackal no longer needs to travel as far. Opportunities are closer, more frequent, and the leopard finds chances again. Less effort, more encounters, more possibilities. The pressure eases, the system breathes, but it does not stabilize. Because here, rain does not mean permanence, it means interval, a brief moment, within a much longer cycle. And everything seems to understand that. Nothing is wasted, nothing is taken for granted. Every second matters, because just as quickly as it arrived, it can disappear. And this kind of cycle doesn't happen only here. So with the return of water, even if temporary, the landscape begins to offer opportunities once again. But this time, it's not only wildlife that responds. Human presence becomes more visible. Across different parts of this region, communities have lived alongside this environment for thousands of years, not as observers, but as active participants. In some areas, especially near the desert, traditional ways of life remain closely tied to these natural cycles. Nomadic herders still move across the land following patterns that don't appear on any map. They read subtle signals, the color of vegetation, the moisture in the soil, the behavior of animals, details that might go unnoticed by others. But here, they define everything. Moving at the right moment can mean survival. Waiting too long can mean loss, and in that sense, their logic is not so different from that of the animals around them, adapt, anticipate, respond. In more fertile areas, like parts of the Jordan Valley, the relationship with the land takes a different form. Agriculture becomes established, but never fully independent from nature. Water remains the central factor. Irrigation systems guide its flow. Some methods are ancient, others are modern, but all attempt to solve the same challenge: how to sustain life in an environment that doesn't always cooperate. And that balance is fragile, because greater control often creates greater pressure. Demand increases, usage intensifies, and what once depended on natural cycles begins to depend on human decisions. That shift changes everything. Jackals move closer to cultivated areas. Foxes explore new spaces. Some birds find new feeding grounds, yet others lose their traditional routes. Not all interactions are negative. In some cases, human presence creates new opportunities. Water reservoirs become resting points. Fields attract insects, and with them, other species. But this balance is unstable because it wasn't designed. It is evolving, still forming, still shifting. At the same time, there is something deeper. For many cultures in this region, nature is not just a resource, it holds meaning. Mountains, rivers, deserts. They appear in ancient stories, in traditions, in ways of understanding the world. They are not just landscapes, they are part of identity, and that creates a different kind of relationship. One not based only on control, but on observation, respect, adaptation. Still, the modern world introduces new pressures: expansion, technology, growing demand, and with that, a question begins to emerge. Quietly, but persistently. Can this balance be maintained? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a deeper transformation? Because when a system this precise begins to shift, its effects rarely remain isolated, and everything connected to it eventually feels the change. The water that brought life begins to fade, at first almost unnoticed. The flow slows, currents weaken, and gradually the wadis begin to dry once again. The ground absorbs what remains, the surface hardens, and the green that appeared so suddenly begins to lose its intensity. The transformation reverses, but not completely, because nothing returns exactly to where it began. Paths have changed. Areas once unused are now part of daily movement. Ibex continue across the slopes, but no longer along the same routes. The jackal adjusts its range, expands again, searching for whatever remains available, and the leopard returns to silence. With fewer exposed prey, every movement demands patience once more. What once felt like abundance was only an interval. A brief pause within a far more demanding cycle. And now, that cycle begins again. But this time, something is different. The environment no longer responds only to natural patterns. Across different parts of this region, human presence has altered the flow of water. Reservoirs hold what once moved freely. Irrigation systems redirect moisture into areas that would otherwise remain dry. And slowly, the rhythm of the ecosystem begins to shift. For some species, this creates opportunity. New water sources attract life. Insects gather. Birds find new resting points. And certain animals expand their range. But not all benefit. Changes in natural flow affect a balance shaped over thousands of years. Plants adapted to scarcity now compete with new forms of vegetation. Migration patterns begin to shift, and highly specialized species face a silent challenge: adapt again or disappear. What was once unpredictable, yet consistent, now includes a new factor: interference. And that makes the system more complex. Because now, it is not only climate that defines what happens. It is also decision. Decisions about water use, about land, about how far this environment can be altered without breaking its limits. And that limit is not always clear. Still, life continues to respond, as it always has, adjusting, reconfiguring, searching for balance, even as that balance keeps changing. And perhaps that is what defines this land more than anything else. Not stability, but constant transformation. Nothing here remains fixed. Not the environment, not the animals, not the paths that connect them. Everything is in motion, all the time. The Holy Land is often seen as a place defined by its past, ancient stories, civilizations, moments that shaped history. But something else continues here, every single day. Far from records, far from memory. A cycle that doesn't depend on history. It depends on survival. The drought returns, water disappears, and still, life continues. Not by chance, but through adaptation. Each species responds in its own way, through precise movement, through decisions made at exactly the right moment. Because here, nothing exists in excess. Everything has a limit. And it is that limit that defines what remains. Throughout this journey, we've seen a system where every detail matters, from the smallest shift in climate to the choices made by animals and humans. Everything is connected. Everything responds. Everything adjusts, but never permanently. And perhaps that is what makes this land so unique. Not only what has happened here in the past, but what is still unfolding. Because even now, everything is at stake. As the environment changes, life continues to adapt, again and again. Because in this place, survival has never been guaranteed. It has always been earned. Stories like this are unfolding right now, in places most people never notice. If this is the kind of story you want to keep exploring, subscribe to follow what comes next. And almost always, by those who understand the exact moment to act, before it disappears.